Hi everyone and welcome to this recap video for episode 2 of Beyond the Kit. Last stream we tinkered with the setup of the EQP5 Passive EQ Kit from DIYRE recording equipment. And in this recap I'd like to explore in a bit more detail the principles employed in the EQP5 unit and the changes we were making. Here's a simple representation of how filters and analog signal processing work. It also happens to be pretty close to my understanding. Let's imagine a single filter circuit for a second, and let's pretend instead of metal wire conducting electricity, it's a cave full of bats. People like swarms of bats, right? Our signal in this metaphor is the swarm of bats. The bats start deep down in the cave and then fly out to the entrance, which we imagine as our speaker. So we hear whatever bats fly through the cave and out of the entrance. The more bats that make it out of the cave, the louder our signal is. Now let's apply this metaphor to the humble voltage divider. Voltage dividers can be used to attenuate or turn down the volume of a signal. The voltage divider is also at the heart of each of these filter circuits in the EQP5, so understanding how to use one is useful. A voltage divider might look like this. Here we see the input where all of our bats start, and here's the entrance to the cave. But see these two resistors in the middle here connecting them? One of them is going to the entrance of the cave and the other is going to another place, a far more cavernous place, from which bats never return. This place where bats go to die in regular terminology is called ground. And if these two resistors of the circuit are the same value of resistance or the same ohms rating, we can imagine that the caves are equally appealing to the bats. And half the bats would go to the underrealm and the other half would come out of the cave and we would hear them. So that is how you make a signal quieter, because fewer of the bats make it out of the entrance of the cave. And if you change the relationship between either resistor, you can send more bats to the entrance of the cave, or you can send more bats to ground and make it even quieter, or, not as quiet. So now that we've got that covered, we can get to how filters work. What if our bats were all different sizes, ranging from super tiny bats, which represent high frequencies, to rather large bats, which represent low ones? And what if one of the cave bats was full of stalactites and stalagmites? The tiny bats might be able to fly through with ease, whereas the large bats would have trouble squeezing past. Well, this, in effect, is what a capacitor does in this scenario. A capacitor allows tiny bats through, but increases the difficulty or resistance experienced by larger bats as they try to fly through. The larger bats just want to go where they can go, and so they take the path of least resistance, which in this case leads somewhere other than the entrance to the cave. So if we wanted to have fewer large bats escape the cave, we would put a capacitor to the entrance of the cave and a resistor to ground, which in this analogy is a deeper, darker part of the cave. And if we wanted the opposite, and we wanted tiny bats to go to ground and large bats to make it out of the cave, we could flip the order of those components. There's also another component, the inductor, that lets big bats through but not tiny bats. But I can't think of a good way to bring it into this analogy, but of course it's an analogy. So yeah, the EQP5 is just 4 of these forks in the cave in a row, each one set to filter for bats of various size, one to encourage tiny bats or to boost their presence, and another to take them out or to cut their presence, and one to let large bats through, boost again, and then one to cut them out. So now let's talk about the mods we did in episode 2. All mods were accomplished from just swapping out the capacitors in the filter circuits and changing their value. I made up a special daughter board that had all of the capacitors in sockets, so I could just quickly take them out and try different things. And I had a big spreadsheet of alternate values that is available online that were all made up with a filter calculator. And we played with all different sorts of settings. I mean, we brought the high boost down to 8K, which was a really dramatic effect, and brought the low end up to make it even more aggressively cut low end. And all the while we were stopping and using this tool called Room EQ Wizard to plot the frequency spectrum of these changes and get a sense of what specifically was happening to the signal. Towards the very end of the episode, we tried a 40K boost, which had a really cool subtle effect because even though it's above the audible spectrum, its Q factor was such that it affected a broad range of frequencies that trailed down towards the very top end of the audible spectrum. And so added a little bit of crispness and brightness to the signal. And that was really cool just to think that you could have that a button press away to just really add some air to a signal. Yeah, it was very easy to make the mods. It was very fun. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, and I enjoyed making this recap and this explanation. Next week, we'll be doing the CTX color from DIY recording equipment, and we'll be swapping in different transformers and getting a sense of how they affect the signal. And because really you could put any transformer you want on there, and that would be a sick mod to do. So please tune in for that. That'll be this Saturday, April 28th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, noon West Coast. And yeah, we'll be doing that on Facebook. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time.